All right, good morning. I've been given the thumbs up, so I'm going to go ahead and start while everybody else files out. So this morning, we're going to be looking at two chapters. Try to squeeze that in. Chapters 25 and 26. But I was thinking this week, I don't know if anybody knows this gentleman, Steve Kornacki, kind of a famous political analyst on NBC News, a expert in data, does a lot of political analysis. I think he kind of rose maybe to prominence or fame. I don't know if it was during the 2020 election, maybe it was before, but he's kind of got the, although he doesn't have it in this picture, he got famous for he would wear these khaki pants, white shirt, and he'd go in and go through all this analysis of, whatever the political election was going on and state by state, counties, whatever, what was on the mind of voters. So just kind of made me think a bit, kind of start this off with maybe a little bit of levity. But what if we could take Steve and put him in a time machine and send him back to 1015 BC? Because that's around the time of what we're studying right now, or the chapter we're going to be looking at, roughly around 1015 BC. So let's send Steve back in a time machine. Israel Political Tracker 1015. All right, so who do we got? We got Saul, the incumbent, popular among the tribe of Benjamin because he's a Benjamite. Maybe he was very popular with those that believed in the status quo, those that believed in tradition. Maybe not so popular if we could poll the Levites, maybe not so popular with the Levites. And why is that? Well, he did kill all those priests at Nob. Maybe that's on their mind. So if you polled the Levites, maybe they'd be like, no, very unfavorable. David, okay, that's not the greatest picture, but, David to me was kind of the young, up-and-coming, bold, daring rock star, if you want to call him that at the time. Right? I mean, he could play the lyre, right? So, obviously he was a great musician, obviously a great poet, as we learn later through all the Psalms. But, kind of the upstart, maybe, viewed, very popular maybe with the young people. Maybe probably very popular in Judah with his tribe. Maybe not looked at so favorably, though, if you polled the people that were maybe the more established, well-off folks who believed in tradition, thinking, hey, we believe in this succession of kings, that it should go from Saul's, down to Saul's oldest, Jonathan, and who is this upstart David that supposedly is going to become king? And maybe you've even got some folks that are even looking at, this is the prophet Samuel, right? Maybe we've got some that are like, if you polled certain areas, maybe amongst the Levites, surprise, surprise, maybe they'd be like, yeah, Samuel's our guy. We want to go back. Maybe there was some that were disillusioned at this point in history with the kings already. God had warned them. Samuel instructed them to warn them what was going to happen when they had a king. Maybe some were already at the point of going, I don't really like this whole king thing. Saul's going around chasing this David guy. He's not protecting us from the Philistines. Let's go back to the good old days of having judges and Samuel. All right. What's the point of all this? I don't know. Having a little fun. But in all seriousness, it does make me wonder. I thought about this a bit really last week when Mike was teaching and he was talking about the town of Keilah. And I'm horrible with pronunciations, as you'll become aware over the next couple chapters here. So just bear with me. But when I thought it was interesting last week when Mike was teaching that, how that David, if you remember, he saved the city from the Philistines. He's there in the city. Saul finds out about it, and now he's going to come after him. David inquires of God, hey, what's going to happen? Are they going to give me up to Saul? What's God's response? Yeah, they're going to give you over. And you thought, wait a minute. David just saved them from the Philistines, and now they're going to basically turn around and hand him over to Saul. And it kind of underscored the point to me of this, is that, there was a lot, just like today, we think we live in a very divided time, and I think we do in our country, especially politically. Maybe back in Israel at this time wasn't a whole lot different. There was a lot of probably divided loyalties amongst Saul, David, maybe even some for Samuel. And I think really the point I'm making is that if you go and you just talk to the average person in Israel, maybe for them, they just wanted to get through the day. They just wanted to have food on the table and be alive. And so, if don't judge maybe the city of Keilah too harshly, where they welcomed David when he liberated them, but were ready to turn around and hand him over to Saul. Maybe we're not all that different sometimes. I'm not sure. So let's go ahead and jump into the first chapter. So going over to chapter 25, we're going to talk about Abigail. All right? That's the wise woman. But first, starts off with this, talking about a faithful servant. So verse 1, now Samuel died, and all of Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him in his house at Ramah. So Samuel finally dies. At this point, he's probably in his 90s, somewhere around that time. He had judged Israel for about approximate dates, right? For about 20 years. Then the kingship, came about with Saul. But if you think about it, Samuel was still very engaged in what was going on, certainly with Saul and trying to, get Saul to do the right thing, and then obviously anointing David. So Samuel was very active, and so you could really consider his time as, quote, judge as maybe a 60-year period of time. So he had been around for a long time, and just think about what that meant for the folks of Israel, that he has now passed and buried in his house in Ramah. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Obviously, we don't have a lot of time this morning, but also because I believe if we follow our schedule, the last Sunday of the quarter we're going to be kind of is kind of going to be a review. So I don't want to go too much into reviews at this point. But just real quick, if you think about Samuel, dedicated since childhood. So after Hannah had promised him over to the Lord, once he was weaned, he got into basically into the priesthood, into helping out Eli. That could have been at a very young age, 3-ish, maybe a little bit older, but regardless, very young, had been serving. He's one of the few, maybe the only one, that uniquely served as both a judge, priest, and prophet. Man of great integrity. We saw that when I taught a few weeks ago on looking at, I believe it was chapter 12, when Samuel basically goes before the congregation of Israel and says, if I've done anything wrong, let me know. And what do they say? You've done nothing wrong. Before God, as our witness, we agree. You have done nothing wrong. So man of great integrity, a leader during this time of transition. Think about, and sometimes it's hard to get your head around some of the dates and the times, but Samuel is leading them from a time of the judges over to kings. The time of judges lasted potentially 350, 400. Sometimes you'll see like 400. I think in Acts it might be mentioned as 450 years of judges. I guess I had forgotten how long of a period of time the judges were around. So think about Samuel's leading Israel now through this transition of hundreds of years at least of judges to now this kingship. Passionate leader. And I like this about Samuel. You could see what we've studied so far this quarter, his frustration, even his anger at Saul, because Saul would not do what was right. He would disobey not only Samuel, but the Lord. And he was passionate. And he was even passionate that even though Saul was doing these things, and God eventually says, I'm done with this guy, we're told that Samuel grieved over Saul. And I think that to me is when you're talking about leadership, somebody that has that type of passion, to me, that's a big, big plus. Okay, so let's move on. Boy, that's hard to see. I'm going to go over this real quickly because we don't have time. If you can see, the events that we're going to be dealing with today are going to be right around this region right here. We've got Ziph, Carmel, Maon, En Gedi, which Mike talked about last week, where the caves were at. Up here, Gibeah, that's where Saul, that's his home base. Ramah, that's where we just read that Samuel was buried, right? But yeah, all of this area right here today is kind of what these next two chapters are going to take place right around that area. So let's go ahead and jump in there. So David rose up, went to the wilderness of Paran, and there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep, 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now, the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife was Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. I guess it's like a Beauty and the Beast story here, right? Nabal, harsh, badly behaved. Abigail, his wife, very discerning and beautiful. Why the writer points out that he's a Calebite, not really sure. Was that some type of insult? Don't know. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep, so David sent 10 young men. David said to the young men, go to Carmel and go to Nabal and greet him in my name, and thus you shall greet him. Peace to you, peace to your house, and peace to all that you have. I hear that you have shears. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing all the time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. So David here mentions a couple times, I think, talking about shearing. And kind of the idea, as I understand it, is shearing would take place in the spring and early fall. And it was kind of a time of maybe celebration. They would have a feast. So David obviously kind of recognizes that that's what's going to be going on here. And Nabal, this man of great wealth, was going to be shearing David's men, and we're told this, and we'll see it a little bit more in the next few verses. His men had been protecting Nabal and his shepherds. So David, I think naturally, thinks, hey, festival time celebration, you've got this great wealth. Can you help me out? I've been helping you guys out. So he says, completing David's thought, therefore let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have had at hand to your servant, and to your son David. Seems like a reasonable plan. It's not threatening. I mean, he's sending these young men. It's kind of funny when you get online, you can get all kinds of strange comments. And some people would say, well, what is David like, running some type of protection scheme here, like a mob boss where he's offering protection, but then he's going to come and extract his money from these. I think, no, I don't think that's what David's doing. I think David is very upstanding in his protection here of Nabal. He's doing this, and I think probably rightfully so when they're going to have this feast during the time of shearing that he's thinking, hey, Nabal, you can kind of help me out here. Seems reasonable. Now let's find out what Nabal's thinking, though. So when David's men come, they say all this to Nabal in the name of David, and they waited. And Nabal answered, who is David? Now, does he not know who David is? Doubtful. Because what does he next say in the next verse, or the next sentence here? Who is the son of Jesse? Okay, obviously then you know who David is, if you know who his dad is. So he's very dismissive of David right off from the get-go. There are many men, or there are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. And I read that and I think, this just comes across to me as a crotchety old man. It just struck me that way. You know, oh, these kids today, they're breaking off from their masters, trying to become king. Okay, is that true? I don't know. Was that a problem during that time? I don't know. But it certainly wasn't true of David. David was completely loyal to Saul. Why did David break away from Saul? Because Saul was trying to kill him. David was doing everything right. So, just right away, we can see right away, Nabal is just, obviously his loyalty, if he was voting, right, it would be pretty clear who he's for. He's for Saul. He's for the establishment, maybe you'd say. Then he goes on in verse 11. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shears and give it to men who come from, I don't even know where? Notice how many times he uses the personal pronoun. I, my. Does that remind you of anything maybe? Well, for me, what it reminds me of is one of probably my favorite parables that Jesus tells, and that's in Luke 12, and obviously, or often it's called the rich fool. So Jesus tells this parable. Now, if you remember the kind of setup for this is somebody in the crowd yells out to Jesus, hey, tell my brother to split my inheritance with me. And Jesus is like, man, why is it my responsibility? So he tells this parable. The land of a rich man produced plentiful, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I'll do this. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? And it's kind of, to me, it's that same concept, right? Of this rich man that Jesus is talking about, and just thinking to himself, I got all this. I've done it myself. This is great. I'm going to take it easy. And Jesus concludes this parable by saying, so is the man that's, not rich towards God. Nabal could have used this lesson, right? To me, he is, portraying or acting out this, this man here, this rich fool that Jesus talks about in spades, right? So what David's men? All right. So David's young men turned away and came back and told David all this. And David said to his men, every man strap on his sword. And every man of them strapped on his sword. David strapped on his sword, and about 400 men went up after David, and 200 remained with the baggage. So it's getting serious fast. David's like, come on, strap it on. Get your swords on. We're going. I'm not putting up with this. Let's introduce Abigail, Nabal's wife. One of the young men told Abigail, behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to greet our master, and he railed at them. Yet the men were very good, talking about David's men. They were good to us, and we suffered no harm. We did not miss anything when we were in the fields as long as they went with us. They were a wall to us both by night and day, all the while we were with them keeping the sheep. Now therefore know this and consider what you should do. For harm is determined against our master and against all his house, and he is such a worthless man that no one can speak to him. So fortunately, one of Nabal's servants has a lot of sense and he knows who to go to, first of all. He goes to Abigail, which says a lot, I think, about her. And he's like, look, you're not going to believe this, or actually maybe you will, because, with that last sentence there, he talks about what a worthless man, this is his master he's talking about, and he's saying it to the man's wife. This guy's worthless. He's not going to listen to anybody. and that harm's going to come to all of us, right? So what does Abigail do? Abigail made haste, took 200 loaves, 200 skins of wine, 5 sheep already prepared, and 5 sheaves of parched grain, and 100 clusters of raisins, 200 cakes of figs, and laid them on donkeys. She said to her young men, "Go on before me. Behold, I come after you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal, which, why should she? Obviously, we've already learned he's not going to listen to anybody. And maybe it's also true, maybe that it could be true that, as the kind of the mistress of the house, it was really up to her to dispose of the provisions for the family as really she saw fit, and she decided to do it herself. But I do think it's interesting that she doesn't even talk to Nabal about this, try to consult him. She takes action on her own. Verse 20, and as she rode on the donkey, she came down under cover of the mountain. Behold, David and his men came down towards her, and she met them. Now, the writer kind of then flashes back to David here for a minute. I think he's trying to make a point, and he says this. Now, David said, "Surely in vain have I guarded all this fellow and his work in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him, and he has returned me evil for good. God do so to the enemies of David, and more also, if by morning I leave much as one male of all who belong to him." So we're kind of getting this like flashback a bit, maybe to kind of reiterate on this story what David's intentions are. He's going to wipe out Nabal. He's enraged at the response. Now, kind of flashing back to the meeting between Abigail and David, because Abigail's gone out now to meet David, hopefully to, rectify the situation here. When Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before David on her face, bowed to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, "On me alone, my Lord, be the guilt." Now that's quite a brave thing to do. Not only is Abigail wise, discerning, beautiful, she's also, I think, very courageous. Here she's going up to David, who is enraged, and the first thing she does is, "Hey, it's all on me." Right? She goes on, "Let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. Let not the Lord regard this worthless fellow," her husband, Nabal, "for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him." So Nabal basically means fool. And this man is absolutely, being a fool. His name obviously was appropriate, and I had to wonder to myself, did his parents give him that name at birth, or did that maybe come along, after the fact, after people started noticing this guy's behavior, and that kind of became maybe his nickname, or I don't know what, but because I don't know why you'd ever name your child fool. And she says, "But your servant," speaking of herself, Abigail, "did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent." So again, she's trying to now rectify this situation, saying, "Hey, look, it's on me. I didn't see them. Okay, I'll take care of it." Very brave. I'm going to skip down through some verses here. That's why I put these screen with 3 dots as a reminder to myself. I'm going to skip down to see David's response. David says to Abigail, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you to meet me. Blessed be your discretion. Blessed be you who have kept this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand. For as surely as the Lord God of Israel lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, truly by morning there had not been left in Nabal so much as one male." Then David received from her hand what she had brought him, and he said to her, "Go in peace to your house. See, I have obeyed your voice, and I have granted your petition." So David, he admits that, he was potentially about to do the wrong thing, right? and then Abigail stops him. He agrees with Abigail's petition and says, "You're right. I'm going to relent here." So Abigail goes back now to Nabal. So Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, this is just great. He was holding a feast in his house like the feast of a king, but he obviously didn't have enough to share with David. And Nabal's heart was merry with him, for he was very drunk. Continues to live up to his name. So she told him nothing at all until the morning light. In the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him, and he became a stone. Some type of medical event here occurs to Nabal. Stroke, heart attack, whatever it might have been. And then we're told, and about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. So regardless of whether it was God who initially struck Nabal or God just finished him off 10 days later, point remains. God is the one that took out Nabal. Right? When David hears about this, he praises God, right? "Blessed be the Lord who avenged the insult I received at the hand of Nabal and has kept back his servant from wrongdoing." Again, acknowledging that he, David, was going to be in the wrong to go and wipe out Nabal. "The Lord has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head, and David sent and spoke to Abigail to take her his wife." Skipping over some verses where Abigail agrees to become David's wife, finishing up the chapter. David also took Amnon of Jezreel, and both of them became his wife. Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, the son of Laish, who was in Gilead. So if you remember, David was married to Michal, Saul's daughter, and then we have this lovely verse 44 where we find out what has Saul done. He's taken Michal, David's wife, and given her to another man. Again, just reinforcing Saul's just depravity, I guess I'll call it. Unfortunately, back then, women at that time, unfortunately, were probably used as pawns quite a bit, especially daughters, to form some type of political alliance or get some loyalty from somebody. So Saul apparently has no qualms with taking the wife of David and now giving her to another man, basically forcing her into an adulterous situation. Good going, Saul. What a stand-up guy. So let's wrap up this chapter. So who's the hero of this story? Probably pretty obvious. I don't think anybody here is going to say it's Nabal, right? If I had you raise your hands, I don't think anybody's going to raise your hands. Is it David? Well, David, to his credit, did realize that he was going down the wrong path and relented. Give him credit for that. But really, it is Abigail, right? Here's this woman who basically saves all of these innocent people by her heroic, courageous action. I think a lesson we can get from this: be generous with your wealth. Don't be a Nabal. He had all of this wealth. I think it was 3,000 sheep, 1,000 goats, and yet he's not willing to share any of that, apparently. Stingy. Leave vengeance to God. David was about to make that mistake. Fortunately, Abigail stopped him. I think there's a time to act, but you base it on wisdom. What do I mean by that? Well, contrast Abigail and David. There is absolutely a time to take action, and sometimes you take that action, it has to be done quickly. In the case of, think of Abigail. She didn't wait around. When she found out what had happened, she didn't go to try to talk to Nabal and reason with him or have some conference with the other folks there, right? She took action quickly to save the day. She did that. We know she's a wise woman. She did that with wisdom. Think about David, on the other hand. Did David act quickly? Yeah, but I would say rashly. He let his temper get the best of him and decides, whoa, you're not gonna offend me like this. I'm gonna take out your entire family. I'm wiping you guys out. Right? So they're both cases of taking action and taking quick action. One is right based on wisdom. The other was rash and almost led to innocents dying. Watch out for your blind spots. Now, what do I mean here? I don't know if this is controversial or not. I don't know. I'm going to offer my opinion. I think what we see there at the end of that chapter, I think we're seeing a little bit of the chink, or whatever you want to call it, in David's armor, his Achilles heel. And I would say that's women. He seems to be acquiring wives at this point like trophies almost. Right? So we know at least he had, at this point, at least 3 wives, and he's going to add, I think, eventually up to 8. Now, his son Solomon is going to take that to the extreme, but even so, David seems to have this weakness for women. Did Abigail's beauty influence his decision? Very likely could have. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But I kind of get the feeling here that we're starting to see David kind of, showing a little bit of maybe something that he should have been aware of, this blind spot maybe that he had, and consulted God about it, and Saul wanted to know what God's decision was, what God wanted him to do. Because we're told, Jesus tells us, that God did not intend for this, man to marry a bunch of women. That was not God's intention. That was the hardness of the heart of the Israelites that God allowed that under the law. But that was never his intention. It was man and woman, singular. All right, moving on to chapter 26, the foolish king. And the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeon, saying, "Is not David hiding himself on the hill of Halah, which is at the east of Jezreel?" Now, the Ziphites were mentioned, I think, maybe it was last week. They were the ones that tipped Saul off, I think, into that David was in the caves, maybe there in Gedi, if I'm remembering correctly. So we can see again, going back to the political situation in Israel, you can kind of see where some of these alliances are laid up. Obviously, the Ziphites are loyal to Saul. And again, they're tipping off Saul where David's located. So in verse 2, Saul rose up, went down to the wilderness of Ziph with 3,000 chosen men of Israel to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul encamped on the hill of Halah, which is beside the road on the east of Jezreel, but David remained in the wilderness. So I think I kind of learned from this, Saul's bringing in 3,000 chosen men. Obviously, he, at this point, maybe he's already done so earlier, but to me, he definitely knows he has to take David seriously, right? 3,000 chosen men. David obviously has a knack for escaping away from Saul. I think we can all know that that's God's doing and not just, David's ability. But moving on. So when David, saw that Saul came into the wilderness, David sent out spies and learned that Saul had indeed come. Then David rose and came to the place where Saul had encamped. And David saw the place where Saul lay with Abner, the son of Ner, the commander of his army. Saul was lying within the encampment with the army, and the army was encamped around him. Seems like a pretty secure situation, right? You've got this entire army of 3,000 well-chosen men. Saul's in the middle with Abner, the commander of the army. Why David decides to seek Saul out, I'm not sure. Maybe it was just he wanted to kind of see where Saul was exactly located and what was going on. So maybe that's why the spies went out and then David goes out. I would think maybe if I was David, I would have just maybe run away. Let's flee and get out of here if we hear Saul's in the area. But nevertheless. So David comes up with this plan, interesting plan. he says to Amalek the Hittite and Joab's brother Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, who will go down with me into the camp of Saul? Why, David? Why are you doing this? This just seems so unnecessary, so risky. And Abishai says, hey, I'll go down with you. I'm not sure why David decided to go down that path, but so David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there lay Saul sleeping within the encampment. His spear stuck in the ground at his head. There again, Saul is never without his spear. Although the author of the book that we've been using for a lot of this material, I think he did make the point, I hadn't really thought about it, that maybe that spear, because I've kind of given Saul a hard time in the past lessons about him, and he's like, just can't get away from that spear. Maybe that was kind of a symbol of Saul's authority as the king. So maybe it was kind of a tradition to go around with the spear. I'm not sure. But they go down in verse 8. Abishai says to David, so they've made it down there undiscovered to Saul. And Abishai said to David, God has given your enemy into your hand this day. Now please let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear, and I will not strike him twice. I assume that means there'll be no necessary to do it twice, because he's going to do it so good on that first stroke, it's going to be all over for Saul. I can understand, I guess, Abishai's thought here, right? That, look, we've made it all this way into this encampment, and here we are. No one knows about it. Saul, your enemy, is right in front of us. Let's finish this. Let's take him out. What's David's response? Verse 9. David said to Abishai, do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? David uses that expression many times about Saul. God's or Lord's anointed. David said, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down in battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed, but take now the spear that is at his head and the jar of water, and let's go. So David took the spear, the jar of water from Saul's head, and they went away. No man saw or knew it, nor did they wake, for they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. Probably no surprise, that last verse. This was obviously God's doing, right? God is the one that put that sleep on that army so that David and Abishai were able to get there without being discovered. So this is the Lord's work. No surprise. So David goes off to the other side of the hill. Good distance between them. He calls out to the army and to Abner, the son of Ner, saying, will you not answer, Abner? And Abner answers, who are you who calls to the king? David said to Abner, are you not a man? Who is like you in Israel? Why have you not kept watch over your lord, the king? And then jumping down a bit into verse 16, we see where David shows the water and the spear that they had taken. And it's interesting that David doesn't call out Saul, he calls out Abner. Now, maybe that's just simple because Abner was the commander of the army. Or maybe, perhaps, David didn't want to embarrass Saul in front of his army, so he kind of goes after Abner. So maybe David had that discretion to go, okay, this is the Lord's anointed. I'm not going to try to embarrass him in front of everybody else. So I'm going to kind of shift this over and kind of, point the fingers over at Abner like, why didn't you protect your king? I thought you were a man, right? Saul recognizes David's voice, and he says, is this your voice, my son David? Now, there's something interesting about that to me. my son David. If you remember a lot of the chapters leading up to this, what we've been studying, how does Saul usually refer to David? He doesn't do it by name. Doesn't he just say the son of Jesse? He's very dismissive. In this case, he actually says, my son David. And I think, my own opinion, I get the feeling that Saul is shaken by this experience. And he is kind of deeply troubled that he knows that David could have killed him again. This is the second time, and yet refrained from doing so. And I think it shook Saul. That's just my opinion. Of course, David throws out the question he's been answering now for a while. Why does my Lord pursue me? What have I done? What evil is in my hands? So skipping down, verse 21 to get Saul's response. Saul says, I have sinned, return my son David, for I will no longer do you harm because my life was precious in your eyes this day. Behold, I have acted foolishly and have made a great mistake. So skipping the rest of the chapter, some of the lessons maybe we can get from this. First off, obviously, God is in charge, and we see that here. We've seen it throughout, obviously, the quarter, through the entire Bible. But here, again, God is the one that's in charge. He put this sleep on this army. Is he the one that kind of pushed David towards this whole incident for his larger purpose? I think it's very likely. Trust in God's timing. You'll notice, if you remember, what David says is that he says, look, I can't lay my hand against God's anointing and be guiltless, first off. This is going to be up to God. God's going to take him out one way or another, whether it's in battle, whatever it might be. God is going to be the one to do it, and he's going to do it on his timing, not my timing. And that's a hard lesson, I think, for all of us, not in maybe the extreme circumstances that David's dealing with here, but that idea of waiting for things to work out according to God's timing and not our timing is a difficult challenge. I know it is for me. Respond to enemies with integrity. I like to think that David's graciousness towards Saul and seeing Saul's response. Now, I get a little skeptical with Saul's response because we've seen this many times, right? But he does seem to be remorseful. And is that because of the way David had responded to him? Possibly. Lesson in there maybe to us when we're dealing with folks that are challenging to deal with, whether it's at work, in your life, family, whatever it might be, is to respond with integrity instead of sometimes, being just returning evil for evil, a harsh word. Repentance requires change. Seems obvious. But, if you look at Saul, how many times has he, and he did it here, I hope this time he was sincere, but how many times has Saul said, oh, you're right, I did the wrong thing, I'm not going to do it again, and yet he turns around and he does it again, over and over. Repentance requires change. Yes, we should be sorry for what we've done, for our sins, but it requires change on our part, right? It's not just we just keep feeling sorry for all the bad things we do and then just keep doing them, like Saul. Finally, I made this point in the last chapter, same thing. Leave vengeance to God. It's never going to work out well for us if we try to take vengeance out on others ourselves. Leave it to God. We're not capable of being, the wisdom of God, having God's wisdom, his discernment, and, we're going to screw up. Taking out vengeance is just not going to end well for us, I don't think. Leave it to God. Okay. That's it. Pretty good timing there. That's the end of the chapters.